The idea of the global dialogue then is to build a space in which we can strengthen our local and national with a more broad and a global perspective. COVID and the pandemic remind us about the fullness of the crisis that we live in, remind us that we need to be at our, even to the ones that do not have a house where to be at this stage. But at the same time, all and everything that is happening with us is connected, does if we want or not. So the idea is to have 2 or 3 main dimensions in dynamic. Have each week one common webinar that integrated and put together some of the perspectives of the pandemic and the world post-pandemic. Second is to have a space in which different initiatives from different networks and different organizations that are already organizing webinars and spaces of thinking could be together and could be at least noted. So from Brazil, could know what is happening in India or in South Africa and could integrate the part and be together on that. In a continuation of that, our idea was that this of being together could help us to reinforce the struggles in which we are already involved in our countries, regions, cities, and planet. We all live in the same planet, but this do not mean that we are in the same boat, as we have been seeing for a long faces, very quick say, let's take some out of the boat. Let's define the ones that should die for others to have a good life. So the dispute is very strong and very, very challenging at this stage. Let's not give up. Let's continue. One other word better than this one is still possible. And we will have now the first global dialogue with Raffaella, the mediation, Geneviève, Azam, Maristella, Svampa, Ashish. What word after the pandemic? So we are just starting. It's great to be together. It's really a pleasure in the middle of this pandemic world to have the opportunity to share with you hope, strength, and struggle. Thanks. Raffaella.
Yes, so let's enter directly the discussion with our, may I say, activist intellectuals we have with us, very well known in their own movements, very well known all over the world, and very committed in this time to help us in understanding how we can use the terrible and heavy lessons the pandemic is providing all of us in order to come out from the crisis with a better and more just world. Of course, it is not easy at all. There are big interests which are fighting in order to reestablish the usual normality or a worst one. And of course, if we want to play this game, we need to be stronger as possible. So the questions we prepare to them for this first discussion of the global dialogue are related to the general issue which is in front of us in these very unusual days. I put the question and then I leave them to introduce themselves and to try to start a dialogue among them. First of all, how we can strengthen solidarity, alternatives, resistances against these the multiple crises, the COVID-19 enlarge and present. then how do the very different, very various, very diversified grassroots struggles can be intersected? One of the elements of this period is a big fragmentation among very large movements, very good experiences of alternative, but the key of this period, before the crisis at least, seemed to be a big fragmentation. Then what program of reconstruction and longer term alternatives are movement proposing? And what are the common elements of grassroots solidarity initiatives? What are the obstacles and risks for social movement going forward? So, you know, it's more or less, yes, the situation and mainly the strategy. What we have to do to be at the level of the challenge we have in front of us. The first speaker will be Geneviève Azam. Geneviève, it's to you now.
Merci. Thank you. Je vais parler en français.
I will speak in French.
Merci beaucoup pour cette
Thank you very much for this invitation. I am very moved to be able to speak here today to people all over the world, while everywhere we are forced into a world without contact of a social distancing. So thank you for recreating all these links and connections that we have created historically. So first of all, I would like to start with the title of this conversation, What World After the Pandemic? I think that we need to accept that the post-pandemic world is the world of the pandemic. This pandemic that will last with all its impacts or in effects, or of another crisis, that of also the climate crisis, and that of incredible inequalities in the world. That is the concrete world we live in. It's not the world which we can dream, but it is where we have to start. At the global level, we are living an incredible shock, and this shock came from the heart of the globalized world. The heart of the globalized world right now has stopped, and this has spread out to the whole world in very different ways. But I want to say in these times that it's not the virus that attacked us. We're not in a war against a virus. We are the ones who have become vulnerable. We are the ones who have destroyed the life network between humans with the inequalities that I mentioned, but also with the rest of the living world that has been destroyed and has made us incredibly vulnerable, and this for a very long time. And what's interesting in the shock is that it touches the centers of financial and political power. And here now I'm European. I forgot to present myself. I am Geneviève Azam. I am an economist, and I'm part of an association called ATTAC, which is French, but is also an international organization. And I participated to the process of the World Social Forum. So this virus or this shock reaches the centers of power, and in particular, or at least I hope, will be able to look at this Western centrism, the pseudo-European power that is being questioned today. I'm having fun in France in a way. We've been waiting for 2 months now, the wave of the virus in Africa, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. And this wave of the virus isn't arriving in the same way that it came to Paris or Wuhan in China or other places. It doesn't seem to arrive. It doesn't mean that there won't be a lot of deaths in Africa. It will happen in India and other countries, but it won't be from the virus itself, but because of the state of vulnerability in which these societies find themselves. So what I'd like to say is that before we can think of the post-pandemic world, we have to think of the pandemic world because it will persist, it will continue. We can't we see this as just a crisis or an accident on the path that we can solve with just a few solutions here and there. And with coming out of the crisis, the world of tomorrow, and I think that by thinking in this way, we become aware that we have today, and for maybe a very short time, a historical opportunity. Aviation is grounded. The automobile industry is stopped. Many, many killer industries are stopped in our industrial societies. So we might have a historical opportunity here to be able to work on the roots of this vulnerability, a historical opportunity and a duty, a moral duty, because it would be a crime to not take this opportunity, seeing what we've seen, a moral, political duty, and maybe even spiritual duty. We have to go through what we're living now, start from this lived experience, lived everywhere, globally at the same time. So a few words on what has come to a halt. Now I'm going to speak from France, from a European perspective, but what has been halted is the heart of global capitalism. It's the core of the thermo-industrial civilization. It's aviation, it's automobile industry, it's the oil industry, and all the fossil industries and productivist agriculture, tourism, a grand part of the chemical industry, etc. So everything that makes us vulnerable, what I call the machine killing life, everything that fights life has been halted right now. Of course, some are dreaming of starting up everything very quickly, but for now it is halted, and I don't think it will start anytime soon. So we're living this collective experience of what is essential, what is the essential, what are the important things. And we're seeing today that the world, this earth that we thought was totally available for us, which is the German sociologist Rosa say, is that now it's unavailable. We are now confined into our apartments, and we are facing what is essential, what a philosopher that I really like, as Simone Weil, calls the experience of need. And the dignity of need, the dignity of what is essential, the dignity of the present and of essential goods. So we're living the crumbling of this great neoliberal promise of free trade, prosperity, health, and suppression of death in the craziest dreams of the transhumanists. So today we're seeing what is halted, because it's what makes us vulnerable, but what is also still standing and what has been standing in our societies. And I think that that's everywhere in the world. What has been able to stay and becomes visible, which are all the activities, the health care, the care around health. And we're seeing in our societies, in our Cartesian societies of the North, bringing back out a more holistic vision of health. Health isn't simply the hospitals, hospital beds. Yes, that is part of it, but it's also the high tech, but it's also low tech. Health is also a low tech part. There's the day-to-day health, there's food, there's the air that we breathe, the quality of the social relationships that we can build. And it is a social equality. That is what becomes visible today. And what becomes visible today is how all these alternatives that we had built, some saw them a bit from up high, what we called alter globalization. These concrete things like the social economy, um, uh, food independence, and all these things have become really a focus and essential in our societies to be able to feed ourselves and to have access to goods that are created in the best way, to have a contact with our producers, a society of contact, including physical and social contact. So, and all the activities around the cleaning, the recycling, the repairs, in which, of course, we find a lot of women, many women, women who have become visible, who are really the spine of what has allowed these societies in this shock, this unprecedented shock in the world. Societies that are still there, we're not in a war one against the others. These societies have been able to hold it together because of all these activities, and the visibility of all this work. And I'm going to end on this, and I think this is true globally. I think that what we're seeing today, what we can perceive, what we need to develop further, express, share, and share at a global level, are all these experiences around cooperation. But it's not just charity. It's not really the care only towards the others, because the fact that of entertaining and of taking care of also heals ourselves. So we can see a total shift of civilization, a shift of the world, which means that everything that has to do with production, the image of the producer, the extractionist, the accumulation of wealth and growth, is halted today. It's halted because that's what makes us vulnerable. It's a great part of that that makes us vulnerable. When everything that we've said, the reproductive activities given to the women that we've considered as the second class, these are the activities that are rebuilding this network of life that has been destroyed. So these are the worlds that we want today, a world that is totally flipped on its head. And I think of Maristella and Laura and all the involvement of the ecofeminists. We have to subordinate all these production activities of growth and extraction to give priority to these activities of care and maintenance and taking care of. And what has been impressive in France is that from the beginning, from the first day of confinements, came out everywhere. And now we're building federation structures that we call COVID cooperation. So everywhere on the territory, there are cooperation structures between neighbors, on streets, on the little towns, to help the homeless, the migrants, the people who don't have enough to feed themselves, the people who are suffering of violence, and all the violences of the situation we're in right now. And these organizations have built links with agricultures, to make sure that there's a chain of supply, and all these needs to stay. There's been a fail from part of the neoliberal state to offer this safety, this security that we needed. They haven't created a safety of life, and it is all these initiatives with a lot of women within them that have really been the spine of our society through all this. Thank you very much, and we'll come back in the discussion later.
Thank you very much, Geneviève. And it's a good beginning. And now it's time for Ashish Kothari, which come from India. So a really interesting, let's say also dramatical, tragic perspective. I Ashish, remember to introduce you, because this was the agreement and Geneviève forgot it.
Yes. Thank you, Raffaella, and thank you to the Global Dialogue organizations for this opportunity. As an Indian, I have a heritage of British colonialism, which makes me speak English very fast. So please do warn me if I speak very fast at some point. I'm Ashish Kothari. I work with an Indian environmental organization called Kalpavriksha. I have been a activist researcher for the last 40 years on various issues of rights and environment and development and so on. And in the last few years, coordinating a process called Alternatives Confluence or Vikalp Sangam, which tries to bring together a lot of the radical systemic alternatives in India and also the global tapestry of alternatives, which is a more global version of the same thing. I think a lot of what I am going to say will complement, in some cases overlap with what Geneviève has said, but coming from the south, from India. Firstly, of course, recognizing that this is a huge humanitarian crisis, not just because of the health implications, of people being infected and dying and so on, but even more so because of the kind of state actions that have been taken. As for instance, in India, for the last almost a month, we have had a complete lockdown, which has meant massive amount of economic disruption, especially in the lives of the 400, 500 million people in India who are casual, daily wage migrant workers or small farmers or forest dwellers or fishers who either cannot go to work anymore or whose work has stopped or who cannot access their farms and forests and or market their produce. So this is it's the first time in history, at least for India, that we have had an impact of this kind. But it also shows to us the vulnerability of such a large number of people in an economic system that is dominated by capitalists and or the state, and where we haven't actually created an economic system in which people can be much more self-reliant and be able to have dignified livelihoods in their own communities. And that's something I will come back to as an opportunity, which is what I think Geneviève has also pointed to. But it's also a crisis because it's giving governments an excuse to step up state surveillance, to become more authoritarian in the name of security and so on. And I think this is a massive existing and an even bigger future problem that we must always confront. So whatever I say after this will be in the context of recognizing this huge problem. Also the problems, for instance, of how racism has reared its ugly head, actions against people who look Chinese or who are Chinese or whatever it is, and so many other forms of discrimination. And yet, I think, echoing Geneviève, I think it's also an incredible opportunity. I go back to the Greek word, the origin of the word crisis, which is krisis, which means opportunity. And I think we need to be able to seize that opportunity. Both in terms of responding to the pandemic as it is now, and I agree with Geneviève, we are in this world right now and it will be in for at least some amount of time, and we need to be able to respond to that. But also, once the virus goes away, what do we do after that? I think we have an incredible opportunity for a number of reasons. One, for a lot of people, for probably hundreds or tens of millions of people, faith in the current economic system or the current global order has been shaken, at least to some extent. Faith in the globalized economic system has been shaken, at least to some extent, especially those who were dependent for their livelihoods, including many rich people, on global economic and trade systems, right? Secondly, because of the fact that there is a much greater visibility now in the media, or for all of us, about the fact that underlying this economic global globalized economic system, there are still all the alternative economies and the alternative relationships of sharing and caring that survive. And it's that which is actually enabling a lot of us to continue being able to deal with this crisis. The everyday acts of solidarity that our people are showing, the kinds of compassion that people are showing, what's happening with respect to helping elderly people, for instance, who can't go out shopping, um, or the local exchanges that have restarted between, say, food producers and consumers. I mean, there are so many examples of this around the world, and I think we're becoming much more aware of the fact that these things do exist and that they have a life of their own. I think a crucial aspect of what we need to do now and in the coming future is to make the connections between the pandemic and the other global crises much more clear. The ecological crises of biodiversity loss, climate change, pollution, and so on. So, for instance, the fact that many more people are dying where the conditions are already polluted or unhealthy, including in the so-called developed world, right? Like Raffaella, your situation in Italy, or what's happening in the US. The connection between the loss of natural ecosystems and the creation of, or not the creation, but the fact that viruses are jumping from there into human hosts, and the global crisis of inequality, which has made so many hundreds of millions of people vulnerable to the kind of actions that are being taken right now. Increasing this understanding in our children, in the youth, in people across the world will help us to actually be able to create and seize the opportunities of changing the world very fundamentally. We then need to look at what are the practical, very practical, realistic, already existing alternatives that can help recreate systems, that can help recreate food security and sovereignty, that can help recreate local exchanges in a very rapid way, so that we're doing it right now, even as the pandemic is on. So what are those alternatives that are available that can be immediately pushed by communities, by civil society, and even by those government agencies that are sensitive to this? And then, beginning now and in the long run, the systemic changes that are needed, some of which have been indicated by Geneviève, pushing for economic localization rather than globalization. But to make sure that that localization is an open one, it's a just one. It's not something which says, okay, I'm going to close my boundaries to refugees who can't come in. Not that kind of right-wing localization, but a really open, just, fair localization. Pushing for solidarity over competition and individualism, or cooperation, as Geneviève put it. Pushing for self-governance and autonomy over centralized state domination or corporate domination. Pushing for workers to be much more in control of the means of production rather than capitalists who will lay them off anytime such a crisis happens. Community health systems versus privatized health systems, and so on. And maybe later in the discussion, we can give many examples of where these sorts of transformations are already taking place. But finally, also trying to bring back and make visible the alternative worldviews that exist. Modernized, globalized development is one worldview. It's unfortunately dominated us for the last several decades. But there are so many other worldviews, many of them from indigenous peoples like Buen Vivir from South America, Sumak Kause, etc., Ubuntu and all its other complementary worldviews from Africa, from the South Asian context, Swaraj and Sahaj and many others, and or from Australia, Aborigines, the notion of country, and then the new ones that are emerging from the industrialized nations also, ecofeminism, eco-socialism, degrowth. I mean, there's just a whole pluriverse of such alternatives that really need to be brought out right now, because they can show people that we do have an alternative to this dominant system. It's not the only way to go. And I think what will hopefully bind together a lot of the fragmented movements around the world, that was one of the questions that you asked, is not that we can replicate each other. It's not that you should be like me. in the alternatives, but that we have a common thread of ethical principles, some of which we've already spoken about, like solidarity or cooperation instead of competition, autonomy instead of dependence, etc. And I think if we can lay out, and maybe later in the discussion, I can bring back some of these values that have emerged from the Indian experience, and have agreements on these, and they will see different manifestations, but have agreements on these, we should be able to build much more solidarity between both the movements of resistance against the dominant system and the movement for constructive alternatives of various kinds. So for the moment, I'll end there, and then I will come back with maybe responses to the questions and further thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. At least at me, you are giving me hope, which is needed to be stronger, to try to be strong. So Maristella, Svampa from Argentina, and ecofeminism, and a point of reference for many of us. It's your time, and then we will. Okay. No. Let's go.
Go ahead. Hello, everyone. Thank you for this invitation. My name is Maristella Svampa. I am in Argentina, south, and I will speak in a language that is not mine. I will speak in French. First of all, I would like to thank you for this invitation and this possibility to have a dialogue with Geneviève, Ashish, Raffaella, and Moema. It is an exceptional opportunity. And so I'd like to mention, first of all, that I agree with a lot of what Geneviève and Ashish have said. I think that indeed we are at a crossroads of civilization, and there are new economical, ethical, and political dilemmas. If we can rethink the crisis in other terms, of course, we can think of global, national, regional, but also geopolitical, north-south. We can formulate these dilemmas in the following way. I think that we can either go towards a globalization, maybe not neoliberal, but more authoritative, going forward with the paradigm of security and controls that could bring us to a capitalism of disaster, like Naomi Klein says, and that will consolidate even more the inequities that we already see, and will consolidate also, of course, the ecosystemic collapse, or without being naive, because we do realize the seriousness of the situation and the extension of the global crisis, we can think of a different horizon for civilization, of a more democratic globalization that tries to make the link, this articulation between the grassroots movements, social movements, and their traditions and their narratives, and the world on of the top that is personified by the state now. Because the first thing I wanted to say was that now we have the impression that this is the moment of the state, not of the social movements or social struggles. It is the state that is at the center of all this, and at the center with all the issues and ambivalences, because we with this emergency, there's the concentration of power in the hands of the president or of the state, but it is also a certain type of social state that is intervening to not only strengthen the solidarity system, but also to be able to help through the impacts of the economic recession. And there are millions and millions of unemployed right now in China and India and everywhere. And I can tell you in Latin America, 53% of the population is in the informal sector, and they are very much impacted by the crisis right now. The crisis that hasn't even fully arrived yet because the state is trying to be present and help. So that's why, like Geneviève said, we have to think of this in this world of the pandemic because we're not out of it yet, rather than thinking of a post-pandemic world. To come back on the issue of the state, there's a paradox in this. The exceptions, a control on freedom of the individuals for the common good, and on the other side, the role of the state through the pandemic that opens this possibility of the connection between the people, and this is personified by the social movements and social struggles. So when we look at the situation, we see an international environment very much touched right now by right-wing populism. So this tendency of finding national solutions and not international solutions, and this trend of closing borders and a reaffirmation of nationalist views is a reproduction of social fascism, really. Now facing fear and uncertainty of recession, we have a trend. A lot of people have a tendency of closing and leading and putting this with nationalist or xenophobic governments and a closed capitalism closing itself to national borders. And we have to think of this because in our societies, and Latin America is not an exception, we don't see it only with Bolsonaro in Brazil, there are strong social movements toward authoritarianism that are trying to have a political expression in the world. If I come back to the phrase of Luis González Reyes from Spain, who says that in this environment, we have to think not only of this contrast and clash of wealth, synthesizing the 99% against the 1%, we have to add to this 20% or more of the population that supports fascist ideas. So we have to add to this 1% of the richest, a 20% of the population that might adhere to a fascist narrative or politics. And this brings more crisis, both sanitary crisis, political, and with fascist reactions that are very worrisome. The third question that I'd like to bring up is, I think that as Geneviève and Ashish said, that this crisis also opens a portal to a cognitive liberation process, a process that I bring from the sociology of social movements, which is what was considered before as impossible is now seems possible. These cognitive shift that brings us to the possibility of answering to this narrative of emancipation, and that brings us to think of the possibility to think of a UBI, for example, and that it is possible to tax the great fortunes, also to suspend foreign debt. So we have to be aware of this, also this opportunity or openness that presents itself in many regions of the world. Radical thought of intellectuals and politicians now are thinking of what is synthesized in English by the Green New Deal, a new economic, social, and environmental pact. The environmental word or ecological aspect is important to be able to solve the crisis, and it's important to think at an international, global level, but also national level, to start thinking to a new multilateralism. And I will end with the last point, because I see that I've been speaking for almost 10 minutes, and Geneviève said so. The paradigm of care, the importance of these political ideas linked to feminism, and especially ecofeminism, that show the need of thinking of interdependency, complementarity, cooperation as something very essential and important in our societies, our vulnerability and our fragility. So the importance of the care and the help and the cooperation is something that we have to think of, not only in the sense of a general narrative to rethink our relationship with nature, but also in the point of view of public policies. We have to think of a new public system, state system of care in relation to this narrative and to the role of the care has in our society right now. So I'll end on this because I've already spoken quite a bit, but there will be more pandemics, and we have to face the ecosystemic collapse. And we have a major opportunity in front of us, but it's important to think not only in terms of the global local relationship, but also the relationship that is needed between the social movements and social struggles and the role of the state in social terms. Thank you.
No, thank you to you. Of course, it's so interesting to listen to you that we could go on for hours, but we started late. We can go on. We can go forward for no more than 15 minutes. So I suggest to start for this second round, which will be shorter, of course, with Ashish, because he received a question asking him, he had the opportunity to read it, to concentrate, to explain more something about the Indian experiences of self-government, and in the same times also the repression which currently is going on in India on Dalit and Muslim. So I suggest to start from this question, and then we go back to Geneviève and Maristella.
Thank you. I will try and be very quick. Yes, just like I mentioned, the ugly face of racism that has come up in this crisis, there is also even more repression. Of course, it was already there before this crisis, but more repression on many marginalized sections of India, including Dalits and Muslims. Muslims were already agitating because of a very discriminatory law that this government has brought in, which helps to regularize people who come from outside India, everybody except Muslims. And there's been a lot of protest across the country on this. Right now, all the protests have had to be stopped because of the lockdown. But what's also unfortunately happened is that the virus itself has become what we call communalized, which is that it's being called a Muslim virus, just like it's being called a Chinese virus in other parts of the world. And so it's absolutely horrific of the kind of misreading of this deliberate misreading of the situation, which the state is also abetting in. But there are movements which are trying to resist this, which are trying to express solidarity with the marginalized sections, including Muslims and Dalits. In terms of self-governance, there are many examples. Let me just give you one that helps us with this crisis, or two that help us with this crisis very quickly. One, in central India, in mostly a predominantly indigenous part of the country, there are movements for self-rule or Swaraj or self-governance, where villages are saying that from now on, democracy means we are the ones taking decisions, not the government. Of course, we will also make the government accountable and the state accountable, some of what Maristella is talking also about. But everyday decisions are taken by our village assembly. It's like the assemblies in many other parts of the world. The second example is from South India of Dalit women farmers who for the last 25 years have struggled for and achieved food sovereignty. And what they're saying is that when it comes to basic needs like food and health and water and education and so on, we as a community need to be in control. We are the ones who have to treat these as commons and the decisions taken by us, not corporations, not the government. Which means control over land, seeds, water, knowledge, etc. And I think these are the kinds of self-governance movements that are actually showing the way for how we can deal with these sorts of crises in much more autonomous ways and much more people and community-centered ways. Thank you.
Geneviève, there have been 2 or 3 comment, not question but comments. One person recalling local act locally and think globally, and another one speaking about a global petition to be organized. So it means that in this discussion, many of us are thinking about how we can make visible the opportunities which are inside the alternatives.
J'avais coupé mon micro.
Oui.
My microphone was muted. All right. Thank you very much, Raffaella. I will try to answer. I think that we've spoken a lot of acting locally, thinking globally. I think that that is still true. But what the situation today shows us is that the local are our environments, it's where we live, it's what we can transform, but these environments and communities are also global. It's what I could call the life network. The virus went all over the world pretty much at the same time, so we become aware that of course we need to become earthlings again, really live our own environments, knowing that these communities have a dimension that is totally global. I agree with that. I'd also like to react because I see that there are questions on the chat, for example, the sanitary control of populations. I think that there's another form of fascism that is also possible, which, of course, there's racism, there's also the traditional types of fascism that we know. But I think that today, at least in France, in Europe, it's the case. And I think it is also digital capitalism, the capitalism of chaos, or whatever you want to call it, or neoliberalism, which is what Michel Foucault analyzed. This sanitary crisis is really the opportunity of a sanitary control of populations by the state through new technologies. And I think that there's a need for safety and security from people that's very strong, and we have to be vigilant to make sure that this need for security and safety isn't instrumentalized by the security state, and that this need for safety rather helps us to strengthen our solidarities, or the health of society and people are also the local solidarities. It's all the local and immediate protection of the people. And from my point of view, it's really that, to protect our communities, our environments that have been destroyed, and rebuild them as both as at the social level and the economic level. So it's rebuilding. Rebuilding is really what we need right now. And it is at the same time the case of the global, but it is to take away from the states the capacity, the capability to control the populations, especially the vulnerabilized communities, in the name of a social state. So I agree with Maristella. We have to rethink the state. It's obvious there is a need for collectiveness and the public sphere, but not only on the sanitary point of view or care, because if not, it can become a political control of populations. And it is a soft version of authoritarianism, because it's not only racism, it's for the good of the people, it's for health, it's for the control of the population. We're launching here at least a movement to refuse tracing and tracking of the infected populations, to refuse to take the smartphone, to refuse the app that allows the government to track populations, because we know that if we do that, we lose the possibility to control the data. We are giving our personal data to financial and political and state powers that are huge and powerful.
Thank you. I've seen in the chat, because it's there are now a lot of messages are arriving, and we are going to approach the last moment of our debate. It's a pity, but in any case, we will go on. Then I will provide you with some information about the next step. And Maristella, one of the reaction is this. How not to come back in this period. I try to summarize in this way. How is possible in this period not to come back to the role of state in the sense of statalism, but the idea of the democracy of common, the democracy of the public? Because of course there are some comments which are saying pay attention to come back to the role of the state. And of course, when we speak about the comeback, we want to come back to the idea of public, not the idea of the old idea of centralization of democracy centralized into the state, I suppose. Can you answer a little bit to these messages?
Oui, merci.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to enter in a dialogue with Geneviève also, because it is the whole issue of the state. And of course, everyone says that the police control, technological controls with the new technologies is an issue. It's a major issue right now in Southeast Asia, in China, and also in Europe, and in Latin America. It's relative, because it is much more police control than technological control, but it is there, and we have to think about it, because there are people who think nevertheless that an authoritarian regime can respond to a pandemic situation or crisis situation much better than democratic systems. And that's why I started by saying that the state has this double phase, this ambivalence, and it's not only the technological aspect, but this cognitive link or relationship that people are looking for. People look for safety and security and look towards the state for that. And on second hand, I agree that we have a problem in social movements and social struggles in the last 30 years that hasn't want to think of the state in a more Zapatista vision. For example, in Latin America, we haven't rethought of the state, and now we have to look and analyze and see if there's relationship between the public and the common and the state, and a possibility of openness and a new political narrative, a wider political narrative, and so that this transformative view that supports a lot of social movements can express itself. So in this sense, when we think of the political, social, environmental pact, I wasn't only thinking of, I spoke of also UBI, of fiscal reform, and of a whole transformation that has to be at the center of our discussions. There's, for example, the agro ecology also for me as an Argentinian, that's very important to try to think of the role it'll have in the future, especially because, as you say, Geneviève and others, Ashish also mentions it, when we think of the Anthropocene as a crisis, the Anthropocene is also a humanocene. And we have to rethink not only the extractionism, but also the way of transportation of goods and the relationship between urban and rural. And so we have there a central topic around which we can think in terms of a socio-ecological transition or transformation. And I'll end it here because I don't want to take too much time. Thank you.
It's really a pity to stop this debate, but don't worry, we will have a long time and a lot of occasion to deep this discussion, touching different aspects and point of the comprehensive pictures you have provided us. So first, I think that now we have to stop ourselves before leaving. First of all, I have to say sorry to you, the panelists, to the audience, and to Laura Flanders, because she was supposed to be our moderator of this first panel, which for us is, you know, a sort of experiment and also very important too. But because of a confusion concerning time zones, we have lost her, and you were obliged to have me replacing her, and to replace her is impossible because she's a very brilliant, prominent journalist and activist, and really all of us, we have lost a lot. I hope she will come with us in the next period. Then, of course, I want to, on behalf of the facilitation group, I want to thanks a lot Ashish, Geneviève, and Maristella for the element of this conversation. And I want only to close by remembering that global dialogue is not only webinars. The idea is that it's not only webinars. We hope to build also by using these important tools to build up an opportunity for providing a space for helping and improving connection among social actors active in their own community, in their countries, in their region, at the global level, and also among different cultures, gender, and generations of movement. So the idea is that, of course, we invite all of you to be part of this process, the panelists, of course, but also all the people which are listening and which will listen to this discussion when it will be recorded, available on the social media. We invite you to join the process by registering yourself on the website, by sharing the Facebook pages, which can be used as a sort of portal to inform more largely about your own initiatives, actions, campaigns. In the first days, 16,700 people visited our new Facebook pages, so it's a good beginning. And then we will find also very soon the way, even at the distance, to provide the spaces and rooms not only for panel but also for larger meetings and assemblies, in order to improve the direct contact with each other. And so to stop myself and to end this first webinar of the Global Dialogue, I only mentioned the two next appointments. The first one is will be in a week, so on Thursday, 7th of May at 3 p.m. and we will discuss the offensive of the right and the risk for democracy. Then others will come on the same day, Thursday, and at the same time, 3 p.m. Central European Time. And in the meanwhile, on Monday, May 4th, we will discuss about pandemia, migrants and migration in a webinar organized by the French-speaking group of the Global Dialogue processes. So this is the beginning. Again, sorry for because we started late, because the discussion should take more time, but I believe that it's a very good beginning because of you three, Maristella, Geneviève, and Ashish. Really a good start, and so thank a lot, and let's go on together, and hoping that we will overcome. Thank you very much.